The first big splash of the Steve Cohen era in New York is in the books as the Mets added a pitcher named Trevor. But no, not Trevor Bauer. The market for corner outfielders just got a whole lot more crowded, and a former All Star closer is joining the Los Angeles Dodgers. Hello, everyone, and welcome into this week's edition of Around the Bases here from 110 Sports. As we begin a bit of a new chapter here with Around the Bases, first edition. Instead of focusing on a live stream show twice a week for about an hour, Around the Bases changing a little bit starting this week, and instead, ATB will be a on-demand show and podcast available on the website 110sportsmedia.com, also YouTube, and also in podcast form on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It'll be a half-hour show, roughly. Could go more like 40 minutes or a little less, depending on the week, breaking down the week's biggest storylines in the baseball world. So we're not going to get into every single trade rumor, every single report, every single minor league signing, but instead we're going to focus on the biggest storylines of the week and break down what you need to know in about a half an hour. So let's go ahead and dive right into this week's show. We've got three major storylines to discuss this week. Here's what you can expect. We're going to start by talking about the continued development of the pitching market as we had signings this week of Mike Minor and Trevor May. We're going to talk about both those signings, what they mean, and what we've seen thus far from the pitching market, particularly the starting pitching market. Some encouraging signs, but also a lot of unknowns still out there. We'll also discuss the biggest names that were non-tendered before the deadline on Wednesday. On Wednesday, December 2nd, by 7 p.m. Eastern, teams had to make a decision on whether they would tender contracts to their arbitration and pre-arbitration players. And as a result, several players were not offered contracts, meaning they're now free agents. There are some big name players who have just become free agents. We're going to discuss that and where they could fit in the picture this offseason coming up here today on this show. And then we're going to round things up by discussing a couple of notable trades from the past few days tied into that non-tender deadline on Wednesday. There were a few deals made that could have relatively significant impacts, not huge names, but that could have a significant impact for those clubs. We'll discuss that to round out today's show. So let's go ahead and start by diving in to some of the recent signings that we have seen of pitchers. Last week on Around the Bases, we talked about Charlie Morton, the veteran pitcher, signing with the Atlanta Braves on a one-year, $15 million contract. It was their second starting pitcher addition within the past couple of days, as they also signed Drew Smyly to really help build that rotation up into looking pretty darn good right now. Since then, there have been two really notable signings in the baseball world, both of them for pitchers. Earlier this week, it was the Royals inking veteran starting pitcher Mike Minor to a 2-year, $18 million deal. Now, it's a nice haul for the lefty considering that Minor struggled to a 5.56 ERA in about 56 innings in 2020, pitching between the Rangers and then eventually traded to the Oakland Athletics. Minor previously pitched for the Royals back in 2017, and the team is hoping that he'll be able to regain his 2019 form, his last full season, when Minor impressed with a 3.59 ERA and about 200 strikeouts in about 200 innings. Now, regardless of whether he gets back to quite that form or not, Minor should be able to add some much-needed stability to a young and not exactly surefire rotation in Kansas City, but he shouldn't really impact, this move really shouldn't impact the bigger picture for the Royals, for the AL Central, for the starting pitcher landscape, all that much. But the fact that Minor was able to get roughly $18 million of guaranteed money, though, that does bode well for the starting pitchers that are still on the market. That does give us some positive sign that some of those guys, starters that are still out there, the Masahiro Tanakas, the Jake Odorizis of the world, those second-tier starters that are still on the market, should be able to get a solid multi-year deal with a good chunk of a pretty high average annual value, I would think, based on this. And again, I don't want to read too much into one signing, but it is a positive sign for those pitchers, those starters still out there on the market. The other deal of note this past week was the first, as I mentioned, of the Steve Cohen era, and that was the Mets signing Trevor May. not Trevor Bauer, but Trevor May, formerly of the Twins, to a 2-year contract worth reportedly around $15 million. Now, again, not the big Trevor Bauer signing or the big bat that Mets fans surely want. It's not JT Realmuto, it's not George Springer, and again, it's not Trevor Bauer, but it is a proven reliever that's going to be able to help the Mets addressing an area of significant need. Now, the Mets have had some significant bullpen problems in recent years. Their reliever ERAs in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, those 4 seasons worth of reliever ERAs, those are 4 of the 6 worst in Mets history. As in, if you look at the bullpen ERAs, 4 of the 6 worst bullpens in Mets history were the last 4 seasons. Wow. I mean, that is impressively bad, how bad the Mets bullpen has been in recent years. And that's where May comes in. You might look at his 4.44 ERA in the majors or 7 career saves and think that Trevor May might not be really all that great, but that's a little bit deceiving. Over the last 3 seasons, the 31-year-old has emerged as one of the better relievers in baseball, posting a 3.19 ERA, 153 strikeouts in 113 innings. He misses bats at a high rate, and in my opinion, and I've seen others rank him this way as well, May was the second best reliever on the free agent market this offseason behind only Liam Hendricks. He doesn't have a ton of experience as a closer. He does have some saves. He is a late inning arm, and he figures to serve in a key setup role for the Mets in front of closer Edwin Diaz. He should potentially, hopefully for them, provide some much needed stability for that bullpen that has cost a Mets team that certainly has plenty of offensive talent a lot of games that they shouldn't have lost in recent years. So that's a big boost for them. Of course, I have no reason to believe that they are done making big splashes this offseason. It's just a first step for the Mets as that leadership under Steve Cohen and President Sandy Alderson. They've promised some pretty big things, or at least indicated some pretty big moves are coming likely this offseason, and Trevor May likely just the first of several dominoes. Trevor May saying in a press conference today in his first meeting with the media as a member of the New York Mets, he said, quote, "One of the biggest things is just the buzz around Steve Cohen, and the purchase of the team. The excitement of all the changes happening, my immediate reaction was wanting to be a part of something like that." And that's certainly an encouraging development. Those are the words of Trevor May saying that he wanted to be a part of what's happening now in New York under that new leadership of the Mets. So those are the 2 big signings to know from the past week. There were a couple of minor signings as well, no pun intended. Minor was a bit of a major signing, or a mid-tier signing. There were a couple of smaller signings as well, but those are the 2 big ones. Mike Minor to the Royals and Trevor May, the reliever, to the New York Mets. But let's talk big picture a little bit about what we've learned about the pitching market. It's been pretty good so far, particularly the starting pitching market. Now, the key here to note is that there have been very few multi-year deals handed out to starting pitchers, but the annual guaranteed salaries haven't been suppressed to the rate that many people feared coming into this winter. Charlie Morton got $15 million, Drew Smiley $11 million, Robbie Ray $8 million, Mike Minor $18 million. Don't want to get too excited about that or buy that, but I'm thinking that the starting pitching market might not be hit as hard by teams' collective desire this offseason to cut costs as other areas like power hitters or mid-tier relievers. Only time is going to tell on this, but right now there are some positive indications that in terms of on an average annual value on an annual salary basis, we haven't seen the numbers for contracts handed out so far being too diminished off of what we might expect. So that's our first storyline to discuss today. Our second storyline that I want to get into is about the biggest names that were non-tendered before the deadline on Wednesday. Yesterday, as we're recording this on Thursday, if you're hearing this later in the week, Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, that was the deadline for MLB teams to tender contracts to all of their players with less than 6 years of big league service time. And those who did not get a contract tender immediately became free agents. It's a bit of a technical process, which we don't need to get into the details of too much, but essentially, players between years 3 and 6 of Major League Service time are arbitration eligible, and they're going to get raises each year. They're going to look at historic precedent for players getting raises and what their value should be. And the two sides, if they go end up in arbitration, there'd be an independent panel which would decide the salary for that player. A lot of times, the team and the player exchange salaries, and they're able to come to some middle ground. But essentially, teams have some idea of what their arbitration eligible players are likely to get in 2021, and so then they're making decisions of whether or not they want to pay that cost. If they decide not to tender that player a contract, they're immediately a free agent. If they decide to tender that player a contract, then that doesn't mean that they're immediately getting paid a set amount. It's yet to be figured out unless there's already an agreement reached. But it does mean that you're locked in place to give that player a contract. So several teams deciding to cut ties with some pretty key players. And there was a fear among the industry this offseason that revenue losses as a result of the shortened 2020 season and all the uncertainties surrounding COVID-19 for the upcoming season as well, there was concern that that would lead to a steep increase in non-tenders and then a flood of free agents entering the market as teams were looking to cut costs. Now, there were 59 players non-tendered before Wednesday's deadline. And that's up slightly. That is a record number, but it's only up slightly from last offseason, which was 56. So that on its own might suggest no major differences this year. But that would be a little bit deceiving because the number of agreements on contracts between players and teams before that deadline was also 59. There were 59 times where there was a question of whether the player would be tendered a contract, and they came to an agreement with the team before that deadline. The number of pre-tender agreements, as it is often called, is up from 30 last year to 59 this year. And in many of those cases, players agreed to salaries which were way below what they were projected to earn in arbitration, some of them even taking significant pay cuts in order to avoid being non-tendered and become a free agent. So it's that number, just that we haven't seen that many more non-tenders this year, is a bit deceiving. We also saw this year more high-level players get non-tendered than in recent off seasons as well, because teams are trying to find ways to cut costs, and there's only so many ways you can do that. One of them is to non-tender players, save, $6 million there, $10 million there. Of course, there's plenty of people with strong thoughts about that policy and that system, but that is one way that teams can cut costs. So we saw not a ton of non-tenders relative to what we've seen in the past, but there are still signs that from this that it is going to be a slow and rough off season for especially for those mid-tier hitters, those non-star level hitters. It could be a real rough offseason for them, particularly based on what we saw the other day. It could be a rough market for corner outfielders who are more power first, defense lower on their skill set. It could be a rough offseason for players like that. So let's take a look here, quickly discuss a couple of the free agents who are now on the market who were non-tendered at the deadline. There are some interesting and significant names. One of them is Rockies outfielder David Dahl. Colorado decided to give up on the oft-injured outfielder. Dahl has showed flashes of high-level play in his career. He was an all-star in 2019. He owns a career .828 OPS in the major leagues, but he has often struggled to remain on the field. He's coming off of shoulder surgery. He is expected to be ready in time for spring training 2021, but he really hasn't been able to stay on the field for more than 120 games in any season in the majors thus far. But he's a really intriguing bounce-back candidate who could land with the team for a cheap cost for a team looking for outfield help like the Cardinals or Indians, Astros, or Nationals. So we'll see how that plays out, though I'm not expecting a quick resolution there necessarily. Some of the other names, another name, I should say, that got non-tendered was Archie Bradley. by the Cincinnati Reds. This was a bit of a head-scratching move because the Reds gave up two players to acquire the veteran reliever from the Diamondbacks prior to this past season's trade deadline. It appears that Cincinnati just wasn't willing to pay Archie Bradley roughly $5 million that he was projected to get in arbitration, which just seems a little bit crazy because the right-hander posted a 2.95 ERA. He had 6 saves in the shortened season, and he's immediately one of the top relievers on the market. This was a bit of a head-scratching move for me. I think he should be able to get a pretty good contract. He could fit for a lot of teams in need of bullpen help, whether in a closer's role or in a setup role. He's proven to be a very reliable back end arm for the Diamondbacks, and then continuing that with the Reds after the trade last season. So we'll see where he ends up. There's a lot of relievers in that mold of Archie Bradley, those mid-tier guys who could maybe be a closer, maybe be a setup man. So there's just such a high number of them that nobody's going to be willing to pay a high cost right now, you would think, for most of them. So we'll have to see how his market plays out. Another one, and this is one of the bigger names, was outfielder Eddie Rosario of the Minnesota Twins. Now, the Twins non-tendering Rosario was looking increasingly likely in recent days, but if you just go look at his baseball card stats, you'd say, what on earth are the Twins doing? Because Rosario, who's 29 years old, he's been a fixture in their lineup for the past several years, and he's basically a 30-homer, 90 RBI guy year after year. And he had 13 homers in the shortened season and just shy of 60 games, so he was on a good home run pace then. But if you look beyond that, you see it's a guy who's pretty has free swinging tendencies. He doesn't get on base very well. His defense has taken a big step back, and that puts a ceiling on his overall values. The Twins decided they didn't want to pay the roughly $10 million that he was going to be worth, that he was projected to make, I should say, in arbitration. They have a prospect outfielder, Alex Kirilloff, waiting in the wings. They didn't want to pay Rosario, but it's still very possible he could land a multi-year deal. He's immediately one of the strong second tier of outfielders on the market. Of course, there's George Springer, there's Michael Brantley, but Rosario fits into that next group, that next tier of outfielders who are going to be available on the market this offseason. So we'll have to see what kind of contract he lands. There's a lot of teams, just like the ones I mentioned for Dahl, who could be interested in Eddie Rosario this offseason. But perhaps the headline name of the non-tenders that we saw yesterday is Cubs outfielder Kyle Schwarber. The 2016 World Series hero. He spent parts of the last 6 seasons as a staple of the Cubs lineup. He was projected to earn roughly $8 million in arbitration, not a super high cost relative to everything else, of course, but he's coming off a really disappointing season. He hit 188. He's not a plus defender at all. He's a negative defender in the corner outfield for the Cubs. So in some sense, this move wasn't a huge surprise, but this is a guy who has really plus power. Schwarber averaged roughly 30 homers per season from 2017 to 2019, and so he shouldn't have any problem attracting interest this winter, but it could be a very slow-moving market because, as we've talked about here on the show on Around the Bases before, the DH uncertainty, there's still no certainty of whether there'll be the DH in the National League in 2021 or not. And that's going to affect the market for several players, from Nelson Cruz to Marcell Ozuna to Kyle Schwarber, as NL teams, might not want to commit to a player like that, especially in the case of a guy like Cruz, until they know whether or not they're going to be having a DH spot to fill or not. And so it's really, they need to come to a resolution here. It's a side point. I could go on about this argument, about this situation, this topic. There really needs to be clarity on whether or not there's going to be a DH in the National League. Otherwise, that's just going to be a factor that is another factor slowing down this offseason for guys like Kyle Schwarber. A few other names we're going to hit on here pretty quickly that were non-tendered prior to Wednesday's deadline. Adam Duvall of the Atlanta Braves certainly seemed a bit of a harsh move, given that there were only 6 players who hit more home runs in 2020 than Adam Duvall. He had 16 in the shortened season, but he's a power first guy. He doesn't do much more than homer, and again, it plays into this DH situation. The Braves, not knowing whether they're going to have the DH or not, they wanted to keep the DH left field situation flexible, and that's why it seems like they didn't want to pay what Duvall was projected to make in arbitration, because if they don't have the DH and they sign Duvall, then all of a sudden they want to, there's not really a spot either to add someone to play left field, unless you want to have that Duvall on the bench all the time. So it's a tricky situation. Again, the lack of clarity about that situation coming into play in these decisions. A few other names that were non-tendered: Carlos Rodon by the Chicago White Sox, the starting pitcher, a former high draft pick, but he has shown some brilliance in flashes, but he's also dealt with a series of injuries coming back off of Tommy John. He struggled. He only threw a few innings in 2020, I should say. He'll get interest from several clubs, though, given that he's a potential high reward reclamation project. Outfielder Nomar Mazara was also non-tendered by the White Sox. He could take him a while to get a contract. I'm not sure he's going to get paid very much. He's coming off of a very bad season. Maikel Franco by the Kansas City Royals. This was a harsh move because he was their leader in RBI and in doubles. The former top Phillies prospect had a nice year in Kansas City. Not a great year, a nice year, and they decided to non-tender him, which seemed like a pretty cheap move by the Royals. A couple other non-tendered players: Travis Shaw by the Blue Jays, Jose Martinez by the Cubs, outfielder Brian Goodwin of the Reds, and outfielder Albert Almora Jr. of the Cubs. He was, of course, part of that 2016 playoff team for the Cubs as well. So those are some of the biggest names non-tendered, who were non-tendered, who are now entering the free agent class. There's a lot of outfielders, as I mentioned, a lot of outfielders in that group: Eddie Rosario, David Dahl, Kyle Schwarber, Adam Duvall, Nomar Mazara. Mostly guys who were contained to the outfield corners or maybe even needing to DH. And it feels like that's going to be, as I mentioned, a very slow market for those kind of players this offseason. A final topic for today's show: we're going to talk a little bit about the couple of notable trades that we saw that were connected as well to the non-tender deadline on Wednesday. Teams were, trying to decide maybe they could get something for a player that they might otherwise need to non-tender or decide to non-tender. So there were a couple of trades that were made. The first one that you should know about is the Angels found their replacement for Andrelton Simmons at shortstop, acquiring the slick-fielding Jose Iglesias from the Baltimore Orioles on Wednesday for a pair of minor league pitchers. The 30-year-old Iglesias is coming off of a really surprising career year at the plate. He hit .373 in 2020. Though it was, of course, a shortened season, he missed some time, so it was .373 in 150 plate appearances. That's not a nothing sample size, but it's also still a pretty small sample size. And the Angels clearly won't be expecting production anywhere like that from Iglesias, whose calling card is his defense, much like the guy that he'll be replacing at short in Simmons. Iglesias, since debuting in 2011, he ranks 5th among all shortstops in terms of defensive WAR. So he is one of the best defensive shortstops in the majors. The Angels fill that position at a cheap cost, and he will join David Fletcher to form a nice middle infield double play combo. The Angels, of course, made that move without a huge cost, a couple of minor league pitchers who weren't highly rated, but they've got some big holes, as we've talked about here on the show before, to fill this offseason in terms of needing a lot of bullpen help and needing rotation help. It's really a pitching situation. Like, big time on the pitching is a big need for the Angels this offseason, so we'll see what they do. As for Simmons, perhaps the best defender in his position in the game, Simmons, a Gold Glove shortstop, he is now not going to be returning to Anaheim. A lot of possibilities for him. We'll see how it plays out. The Yankees, maybe. The Phillies, a possibility. The Reds, the Indians, the Blue Jays, those are all some options, but a lot of those teams have different ways they could go or ways they could arrange infielders. So we'll see how that plays out for him this offseason. Final thing to tell you about the final trade that came in just before the Wednesday deadline for non-tendering players. Milwaukee reliever Corey Knebel was shipped to the Dodgers in exchange for a player to be named later or cash considerations. The 29-year-old Knebel is is entering the final year of arbitration, I should say, likely to make around $5 million for next season. So not a super high cost, especially not for the Dodgers. And he struggled to the tune of a 6.08 ERA in about 13 innings in 2020 in his return from Tommy John surgery, which sidelined him all of last year. But prior to that surgery, he was one of the top closers in Major League Baseball. In 2017 and 2018 combined, he posted a 2.54 ERA and 55 saves. I mean, I say he was one of the best closers in baseball, I mean he was top tier closer. He was a top tier closer those 2 seasons before undergoing Tommy John. He comes back, he struggles in a small sample size, and the Brewers just maybe they're not high on him. Maybe a lot of it being they just don't want to. They're not a big market team. They just don't want to spend that money there. Deciding to part with him, and this is a very Dodgers kind of thing to do. Obviously, Knebel, as I said, a great track record prior to the surgery. He also improved down the stretch, even though his overall numbers looked really bad. His last outings of 2020 looked better. And again, it's not a very high cost for the Dodgers, and it could pay off great. Knebel is still just 29 years old. If he can regain that previous form, then he's an all-star closer again for the Dodgers, who, if they have any questions or any real concerns positionally, it is the back end of that bullpen. I'm not saying that they are sure that Knebel's going to be the fix and that's all they'll do to address it, but that's a really interesting upside play for the Dodgers to take if Knebel can regain anything close to his previous form before surgery. So those are our top 3 storylines for this week. Again, the overall rundown, we talked about the pitching market. We learned that starting pitchers are not getting too much of a reduced rate in terms of average annual values, but no multi-year contracts handed out except for that Mike Minor deal. So maybe the pitching market isn't going to be too hurt by the nature of this offseason and all the uncertainty, but a lot of names non-tendered, a lot of hitters non-tendered at the deadline on Wednesday who enter the open market. There's going to be interesting to see how the outfield market plays out. And again, the uncertainty about the future of the DH in the National League, another factor that is going to slow down this offseason until there is some sort of clarity. So hopefully we can get an answer there. A couple of notable trades again. Jose Iglesias, the new shortstop for the Los Angeles Angels, Corey Knebel, is now a Los Angeles Dodger. Thanks so much for watching this and listening to this edition of Around the Bases from 110 Sports. We'll be back again next week. I'll be back again to talk about next week's top storylines in the baseball world. In the meantime, you can get MLB coverage by going over to 110sportsmedia.com right now. There are multiple recent articles up there, including one discussing a lot of these players I just mentioned, the non-tenders, the high-profile non-tenders from this week, with more analysis on them. So make sure to check that out. Also, some underrated free agents at each position. That article is up at 110sportsmedia.com as well. We'll also have coverage on Major League Baseball if anything big pops up over the next week before the next edition of Around the Bases. We'll have coverage on the website and also on the new show streaming on the 110 Sports Network. That's 110 Daily, hosted by Josh Doring, Josh Molnix, and myself, rotating a group of hosts there. We have that every weekday from 10 to noon, discussing the biggest storylines in the sports world and breaking down our analysis of what all those developments mean. So that's on the air on Twitch, on streaming on Twitter through Periscope, and on our website every weekday from 10 a.m. to noon. So make sure to check that out. Any major baseball news that happens, we'll be breaking it down there as well. But again, that's going to do it for this edition of Around the Bases this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Stay safe, take care of each other, and I'll talk to you again here next week.